Okay, so thanks Greer for that welcome. So my name's Dawn Adams, and as Greer said, I'm a clinical psychologist by background, and now I'm in the Autism Centre of Excellence working within education. My focus is really on autism and mental well-being, and so today we're going to think about how anxiety can get in the way of well-being. We're going to think a little bit about what anxiety looks like and why that might be different in autism, and a little bit about what you might be able to do about it. So the questions I'm just going to answer as we go through is: how common is anxiety in autism? So there's quite a lot of interest in it in the research literature at the moment and within schools. And in fact in the last 10 years there's been a really big rise in a number of research papers. Oh, I'll try. It's not normally something I'm normally quite loud. Let me try and do that. So we're going to think about how common. Is that better? Yep. Okay. So think about how common anxiety is for children on the autism spectrum, and is this just because we're discussing it more, or is it really more prevalent for children without autism? We're going to answer the question: is anxiety the same or different for children on the autism spectrum than children not on the autism spectrum? And then that leads into what signs are we looking for of anxiety for children on the autism spectrum. And then I'm just going to tell you why it's really important to be doing research in this area, and hopefully inspire you all to want to fill in questionnaires if they come your way. So I'm going to give you this warning to begin with. I'm going to tell you about anxiety and autism, but it doesn't make you someone who is qualified to treat or identify anxiety in children with or without autism. If you do have concerns about somebody's mental health, there are many professionals you can talk to and check in with. So I just like to make sure no one goes here thinking that you're suddenly fully qualified to identify and treat anxiety. Okay, so I'm going to give you some take-home messages because I'm aware that many of you are teachers and practitioners, and it's good to have the messages really clear to go away with. So the first message is that no or low anxiety is not the opposite of anxiety. Okay, so what do I mean by that? I mean that it's not just the absence of anxiety. It's not that you have it or you don't. So what happens in your brain? Sometimes your brain will have little thoughts such as, what happens if ... Okay, we've all had them. I won't ask you to share them because they can sometimes be embarrassing. But when you have those thoughts, your brain does stuff to stop you feeling anxious. Okay? Now, those skills you're doing at that point, some children with autism find those skills really hard. So, for example, you might have today, when you were coming here, thought, well, what happens if I get lost and I end up in the wrong place and I don't know what to do? Okay? So that could make you anxious. But what you might do is use something like generalising from the past to help you know what to do to problem solve. So you might say, well, last time I got lost, I asked someone and they helped me. And then your brain would go, okay, nothing to worry about. Don't bother you. We know that children with autism find generalising from the past to other situations very difficult. So this is something which we might need to be thinking about when we think about anxiety and autism. Another area that we might need to think about, of course, is recognising internal experiences and those little prangs of anxiety. So, when you get like a 2 out of 10 anxiety, some children on the autism spectrum find it really hard to recognise and label those tiny emotions, and therefore can't do anything about them until they get too big. So you might, for example, feel a bit nervous before you give a talk or something, and you might get 2 or 3 out of 10 anxious, but you can do something about it to bring it down. But if you don't recognise those signs of anxiety, you don't put the strategies in, and then you don't bring your anxiety down. So I guess I always highlight this because I want you to appreciate that not having anxiety is an active process. Your brain is always doing stuff to keep you feeling calm, to keep you feeling confident, to keep you feeling good. And if we don't appreciate that and teach children those skills and make sure they're there, we're not really helping them to manage anxiety going forwards. Does that make sense to people? Yeah, okay. So that's the first message. Okay, so to go on to the first question of how common is anxiety in autism? Well, to understand that, I'm first going to tell you how common it is in children without autism. Does anybody know the percentage of children in Australia who have a diagnosed anxiety disorder? Okay, so it is 6.9% of children in Australia have a diagnosed anxiety disorder. Okay. Anybody want to take a guess for children with autism? This is across the world, not just Australia, but 7% or 70? 70? 70, 80? 90. Oh, oh wow, this is like bingo. Okay, so this is the diagnosed rate, is 40% of children. Okay, so that is still, what we're talking, 6 times higher than children without autism. But we also know, on top of that 40%, we get another big chunk who just miss the diagnosis. So it's a spectrum within a spectrum. But even though people think, oh, 40, that's not as high as I thought, actually, when you think about it being 7 times higher, it's huge. Okay. And when you look at the subtypes of anxiety, and I'm not going to go into a huge amount of details, but, you know, with your OCD, separation anxiety, generalised anxiety, social anxiety, they're all higher. Okay, they're all much higher in autism than in children without autism. So we're not just seeing one type of anxiety, maybe OCD, as elevated. We're seeing anxiety across the range as being much higher in children on the autism spectrum. So take-home message 2, nice and clear, anxiety is significantly higher in children on the autism spectrum. But not all children with autism experience anxiety or have a diagnosis of anxiety. And that's important because that means it's not an inevitable part of autism. That means we should be doing something about it. It's not that we should just be saying, it's fine, of course he's got anxiety, he's got autism. We know that some children don't have anxiety, so we should be looking at ways to reduce this anxiety, and it's not an inevitable part of being on the autism spectrum. Okay, so the third question I said I'd answer is, well, what's different about anxiety and autism? Why are we researching anxiety and autism? Why don't we just learn from the typically developing anxiety literature? So there's 2 things you need to bear in mind when you think about anxiety and autism. One is this, there's a huge overlap between the anxiety and the autism characteristics. Okay, so for example, these are just some examples that came off the top of my head here, but difficulty or different or absent eye contact, many children with anxiety experience that, and many children with autism will show that. A restricted range of interests in preferring to do just particular things. I know many anxious children who prefer to do particular things because of their anxiety, and we'll see that in autism. And then other aspects, so difficulties starting a conversation or spontaneous social interactions, preferring routine and knowing what's going to happen. You can see how so many of these symptoms overlap that it becomes really difficult to work out, well, what's the anxiety and what's the autism? So this means that some of the difficulties might mean that you miss the signs of anxiety because you're thinking it's autism. And that, we call that diagnostic overshadowing, so where one diagnosis overshadows another one. Okay, so you attribute all the characteristics, the symptoms to the autism, whereas actually they might be the symptoms of anxiety underneath. And this is why, one of the reasons why autism researchers think that we should be looking at anxiety and autism separately, because it's much more complex than anxiety in children without autism. The second reason it's more complex is because we don't just get your typical signs of anxiety, so like your negative automatic thoughts, the what-ifs, but we also, and the sort of hypersensitivity to scary things, so like being hypervigilant. But there's some suggestion, and this is quite new literature, that we get these atypical signs of anxiety. So signs of anxiety that you would only get within individuals on the autism spectrum. So that can be about, for example, anxiety around routine and novelty and restricted interests. So maybe it would be about anxiety about not being able to access your restricted interests or not being able to do your routine as you need to. Or this fear of sensory experience. And if you've ever seen someone with a genuine fear of a sensory experience, it's genuine fear, you know. But we only see those in autism. Now, to make it more complex, as if this wasn't complex enough, there isn't a one-size-fits-all symptom list, because we find there's about an equal mix of people people with autism who just show the typical signs, people who just show the atypical signs, and people who show both. So it's not like you can quickly take that list and say, well, if you're showing all of those, you've got anxiety, because they might just be showing atypical signs, or they might just be showing the typical signs. So this means it's really important to understand autism and anxiety and what that means and looks like differently from anxiety outside of autism. So the take-home message from that is that there's an interaction between autism and anxiety. And this means that autism and anxiety in autism can present differently than what we see in children without autism. So please don't be looking for children to tell you they're worried or scared. You need to be looking beyond that. It's really important to draw upon multiple sources of information. And also, it's really important to consider anxiety when you're looking at behaviour, because that might be what you're seeing. And we're going to come to that next. So this is probably the question you prefer. I just get straight to an answer. So what am I looking for? You've told me it's complex. You've told me there's lots of things. What do we see as signs of anxiety? So we've been really lucky. I'm just going to summarise the kind of work we do so you can see. We've been really lucky to have funding from Griffith University and GIER, from the Department of Education, the Educational Horizons Grant. They've funded some of our work, and the Autism CRC. And Deb and I have been developing a programme of research to describe anxiety in autism. And we have been the first research team in Australia to use some anxiety-specific measures to describe anxiety. And we have been the first team in the world to describe anxiety in children under 8 with autism. So we did quite a descriptive paper in children aged 5 to 6, for example. We've been the first in the world to do a really detailed description of the anxiety symptoms we see at school. And we've got a paper under review at the moment where we're using parent descriptions to say, just tell us what you see. So let's go beyond the questionnaires. You tell us what you're seeing across home, school and community. And actually we're seeing very different signs of anxiety in those 3 settings. So we do definitely appreciate the funding from these streams. And I appreciate the team I get to work with, because we've managed to do this. We've managed to use this questionnaire, which is the only autism-specific anxiety scale there is available at the moment. And it measures typical and atypical signs of anxiety. And we've managed to describe, and it's got 4 subscales. So performance anxiety, anxious arousal, so the physiological symptoms, the separation anxiety and uncertainty. And what we see in younger children is that the most symptoms we see are about uncertainty, finding it very difficult to know or to deal with not knowing. Then we see fairly high levels of separation anxiety, not so much performance, and very little anxious arousal. So the anxious arousal is things like butterflies in your tummy, shaking, feeling sick. We don't see very much of that at all reported. And when we look at older children, interestingly, the top and bottom ones are the same. So huge amounts of difficulties with uncertainty, very little anxious arousal. And so the middle 2 are swapped around. And what's important to take from this is if you probably had to describe what anxiety is in a child, you'd be talking about this. You'd be talking about, well, you might get butterflies in your tummy. Do you feel sick? Do you feel shaky? Does your heart race? Children just aren't showing these symptoms. What we're seeing is much more the difficulties in the top layers up there. So some examples of the uncertainty are things like worrying if they don't know what happens next, or needing to be prepared before things happen. And these are present in both age groups, and there's a researcher we work with in the UK who's shown it stays on into adulthood. So this difficulty with uncertainty sticks around and it'll be there. So this is just some research we've got under review at the moment in one of the good autism journals, where we've been asking parents, like I say, you tell us what you see across homeschool and community. And these are the biggest signs we're seeing. These over here are the biggest signs that parents are telling us they see. So instead of always butterflies in your tummy and shaking, we're seeing a lot of children describing feeling angry and having angry outbursts. Now, a lot of children crying. A lot of children tell us they're just trying to act normal. This is a very hard sign to spot, I appreciate. A lot of running away and hiding. Some children say they feel scared, but these ones are really interesting. The repetitive questions and repetitive behaviours. Again and again, what's coming next? Where am I going? Why are we doing that? What's coming next? Now, what's really interesting to me is that top row, angry, crying, trying to act normal and hiding, you might not immediately think a child is anxious if they're angry or if they're crying. And what we're working with the Autism Hub to do is to develop some resources to help people recognise that those behaviours might be indicators of anxiety in this population. And we're developing a tool to help teachers and parents work together to work out when they are signs of anxiety and when they're not. So watch this space, because we're hoping to get that, because that would be really good when we get that published. So this is my, I think it's my final take-home message. In autism, we see a difficulty with tolerating uncertainty, and we see that across the age range, and we know it sticks around into adulthood. But we know the other aspects of worry can change with age, so we see less separation anxiety and more in older children at higher levels of performance anxiety. So our support should change. We shouldn't just think, right, well, he's got something now at 8 and that's working. When they're 10, 11, 12, what support do we need? We can't just have one size fits all. And I find myself saying this thing over and over. Behaviour may be the child's loudest voice to communicate, and in this case, communicate their anxiety. They may not have the words to say, I'm worried, I'm scared, I'm finding this very difficult. You may have to use the behaviour as the person's voice to tell you. So I'm going to summarise before I pass over to Deb. So anxiety is elevated in individuals on the autism spectrum, but I want to make this very clear. That doesn't mean we should do nothing about it. That means to me we should do more about it. We need to understand more and do more, because it's impacting the lives of so many people. Anxiety may present in typical ways, it may present in atypical ways. So please don't be looking all just for butterflies in the tummy, biting nails. Go beyond that. Be thinking about what anxiety looks like for that individual child. And I often talk about doing an anxiety signature with parents. You know, it's unique for everybody. What are we looking for? And finally, I'm going to say it again because I say it all the time. Behaviour may be the person's loudest voice to communicate their anxiety. But that's only going to work if people are prepared to listen and can understand that behaviour in that language for that person. So, final plug for our research. You may receive questionnaires from our team or other teams, but particularly our team, and you may think, why another questionnaire? You can see what we're doing with it, and we always do appreciate the teachers' input, especially information about school. For us has been really valuable in understanding anxiety at school, because here, an interesting fact, our study is going to be the first one describing anxiety symptoms at school. There's not a single paper describing anxiety symptoms for children with autism at school at the moment. So people who've contributed to that study are doing a brilliant world first. We share our studies on our Facebook page, which I try and put helpful stuff up as well, and we share our results from there as well. And this is a general email address. If you're a parent, teacher, school, anyone, you want to know when new studies are out, just drop me an email there and I'll add you to my list. doesn't mean you have to take part in our studies, it just means you get notification when we're looking for new people and new work, because you can see how it does contribute to outcomes and knowledge, and I hope that's inspired you a little bit to not tut when you next get a questionnaire. I'm sorry. And I'm sorry they're always 0, 1, 2 and 3. I think we're going to take questions at the end, so I'll pass over to Deb now.